Good evening. I hope everyone can hear me, and if you can't, wave your hand or something. I want to thank Juliana for that gracious introduction and for that wonderful, compelling story that she shared with us tonight. And also, I want to thank Lauren Russo for inviting me here tonight, as well as, and she's not present here tonight, but Joellen Shortley. She's the Oakland County Assistant Corporation Counsel, and she also invited me here tonight. So I appreciate being here. Let's see, are we up? Okay. I'm going to try and talk about the opioid crisis in general, what drove us to the point of litigation, and why litigation is a potential remedy, not for all of the heartache, all of the medical problems, but it certainly is a way to drive towards abating the problem and getting the money to pour into the resolution of the problems. And that includes, and much of the litigation is being pursued by municipalities, townships, counties, and eventually some of the states are also becoming involved because they have had to bear, and you as citizens and members of those communities, the expenses related to this, and also the lack of resources to deal with it financially. And so the litigation is a way to try and recover some of the money and to get money necessary for a going forward basis. And also to force the drug companies into accountability. The Department of Justice has prosecuted some of these companies, or at least entered into deals for misrepresentations. But for example, they entered into some deals with some of these manufacturers and distributors in 2007, and no sooner did they enter into the deal, pay the fine, and they were back at it, twice as fast, twice as hard at it. So only this kind of litigation, I know a lot of people look at class action lawyers and they think, you know, you're money chasers, but we literally serve as the private attorney general, so to speak, for this type of litigation. There is simply not the resources otherwise to pursue this type of litigation, or the willingness to take on the big risk, because this is extremely creative litigation to, even though we know they did a wrong, but to find a remedy within the law for selling a legal product, and it is a legal product, and it is a necessary product, and then attempting to, selling a legal product, but selling it in unethical and immoral and illegal, and yes, finding the illegality in their selling of the product that is inherently legal to sell. This is the worst man-made epidemic in modern history. I'm here tonight because I represent Oakland County. We also represent Wayne County. In fact, with Oakland County and Wayne County in an unprecedented setting aside of politics, joined together to jointly file a lawsuit because this problem is so pervasive in this community. And we filed that first lawsuit in Michigan on their behalf. And the difference and distinction here is these are not about drug dealers. The people that have promoted and sold these drugs and created these programs to sell these drugs and to create a new market for them, they sit on your corporate boards. They sit on the boards of your hospitals. They are part of the upper part of your community, people who have power and money, and it's really terrible. I mean, they are basically serving like a heroin pusher, but they wear their three-piece suits and they walk among the community as if that they have done nothing wrong. And that's one of the problems with trying to bring accountability in this situation, and how it also seeped into the community so gradually. One of the reasons our firm became involved was, let's see if I can get the next slide. Okay, because the impact on Michigan was just absolutely shocking to us. As lawyers, many of us were not aware of the degree of this problem. and until it started beginning to get a great deal of publicity. And there were 11 million prescriptions for opioid drugs in 2016 in Michigan. There's only 10 million people in the state of Michigan, actually 9.6 million. So that means everybody in Michigan could have had an opioid prescription. Healthcare providers in different states prescribe at different levels. The lowest is at the green, and those are New Jersey, New York, Minnesota, California. Surprising, but they write lower prescriptions. And then you have the next one, the yellow, in some other states. And the next orange is the average. And then you get to the darker orange one, I think that's the right color. And there are 5 states in there. And one of those states, the one that's highlighted, is Michigan. 107 prescriptions per 100 people in Michigan. So a prescription for every 100, more than one prescription for every 100 people. It places Michigan in the top 10 in the states with a prescribing problem. If you look at this next chart, it's done again by color coding, starting out with 52 to 71, and then going all the way to 96 to 143. Again, painkiller prescriptions per 100 people, opioid prescriptions, Schedule II drugs. And if you look at the Upper Peninsula and you look at the Mitten, we are in that top category of prescribing states. Michigan has a very serious, obviously, opioid problem. And I know Juliana talks some about the death rates in Michigan. Not in Michigan, but the death rates in general. In 2014, more than 47,000 people died from lethal drug overdoses. In 2015, that number exceeded 52,000. Now the numbers will be higher, but these are looking at prescription drugs primarily. This next graph shows the death rate in Michigan from 1999 to 2017, and look at the rise. This problem actually started in the late 1990s. Prior to that, I remember when I started practicing law in the 1980s, I represented physicians whose licenses were being challenged sometimes because they would occasionally give a Schedule II drug to a patient with a long-term chronic pain problem who was perhaps elderly and definitely at end of life stage. And they were doggedly pursued on their license for trying to meet those patients' needs. And then by the 90s, it becomes the standard of care to give these kinds of prescriptions, and it's because of a concerted activity by the drug companies to do this. The Purdue company is a privately owned company, and it's owned by a family called the Sacklers. 4 brothers started that company, and that company has taken a lot of particular bad publicity, and well-deserved, I might add, maybe not enough bad publicity, because Mr. Sackler started the oxycodone, or OxyContin, which is almost all oxycodone, prescription, and marketed that, and started the marketing to get that drug so that it was in common use, this Schedule II drug, very similar to street drugs and very similar to heroin, and in terms of its molecular base. And previous to that, the types of pain drugs that were out on the market that the doctors that I was talking about in the 80s were prescribing, they would be things like Percodan and Percocet, and those would have other combination drugs. The percentage of the opioid type drug was much smaller, where this is like 100% of the opioid. And so the addictive qualities are terrible. And I'm going to talk some more about the Sacklers and their criminal co-conspirators as we go through this. I do want to add one statistic, though, that is not on the chart to some of the statistics that Juliana was talking about. Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50. That shocked me when I learned that. And I know I'm a lawyer talking about statistics, but that's part of our evidence that makes us, first off, that tells us there's a problem, and is there a legal solution? It also becomes our evidence as we move forward with prosecuting the case. What is particularly appalling about this crisis is that the manufacturers and distributors deliberately engaged in a marketing strategy to get the physicians to start prescribing these drugs. They made blatant misrepresentations. They misrepresented the efficacy of these drugs to patients. They reached out to the public. They exponentially increased their market share of these drugs. They went from selling hundreds of thousands to billions within about a 10-year period from these marketing efforts. And to be clear, these drugs have a place for cancer end-of-life patients, post-surgery, post-accident, immediate, but not long-term use. You know, if you wrote a movie script about this, and this hadn't happened to all of us, you wouldn't believe it. You'd think this was just some outrageous story to think that they all got together. You know, they didn't get together necessarily in a room, but one company started doing it and then the others followed in terms of the bad behavior. And the other thing they did is that they have obligations under federal statutes to report when there's overuse and overpurchasing of the drugs or diversion of them. They also managed to ignore those responsibilities. In this litigation, the plaintiffs, in some of our cases, we have some other counties too, but Oakland and Wayne County, they're seeking accountability for the crisis. And the plaintiffs in this multi-district litigation, there's over 2,000 municipalities, which municipalities is broad, means counties, townships, villages, whatever type of governmental entity it is. And Indian tribes, which have had a really big opioid problem. Insurance companies are even in on it now. They want to go in and collect for the fact that they paid money as a result of these activities. They're not quite so sympathetic, but just that there is a widespread impact for this. But it does in fact impact a lot of people's health insurance from it. Other interested potential parties include the state governments. Now, cases can be filed in state or federal court. Most of the claims were filed in federal court, and that's why they became part of this MDL process, which I'll explain. But the state governments, most of them filed their claims. If they filed a complaint, they filed it in state court. Michigan has not filed a complaint yet. But they are still trying to actively intervene in the federal action as well. So, but the state government wants to also get reimbursed for the cost and the expenses associated with the opioid crisis. The United States government has also filed a notice that it has an interest in any settlement. You know, it pays out Medicaid, Medicare, and provides subsidies to treatment programs to states and communities, and it seeks some type of compensation, but it has not filed a lawsuit. For Oakland and Wayne County, we're trying to, and the other counties that we represent, we are trying to recover for the impact on the social structure and the economic impact and the social services that include foster care, the children that are abandoned as a result of opioid addiction, the direct hands-on medical care and therapy that some of the counties actually provide that type of services, increased law enforcement expenses, increased to the judicial system for the number of cases that are before them associated with opioid addiction. Oops, okay. On this slide, the Society of Actuaries, the numbers crunchers for just about anything, have projected that at least $631 billion is the cost, and that's the cost today, not going forward. As this, even if you abate the selling of these drugs, you still have people that have problems, and that's going to have to go for a very long period before those costs are completely abated, if ever. And they say that the cost of this opioid crisis is $631 billion. And while all these companies have a lot of money, I don't know that they have the money to pay $631 billion. And I was listing some of the costs to the community. You also have costs to the emergency responders. The emergency responders have to be trained also how to respond to overdose and how to treat it. The NICU babies, as Juliana suggested. Many, many problems. This is the caption for the first complaint that we filed for Oakland and Wayne County. This was earlier. This was in, I believe, late 2017. And you can sort of see the names of the defendants. At least look at the size of that caption. Now we've done some discovery. It's March 2019. Look at all the additional wrongdoers we identified as we went along. There were a lot more people behind the scenes in companies and subsidiaries because they're trying to hide their bad acts. So they have foreign entities as part of their companies, and they try to shield the money as well as the bad acts through those, and through having these interconnected companies that are difficult to trace. And that's the number of defendants that we've come up with now. Through their actions, they created a public nuisance and a blight on the community. The governmental entities and services they provide their citizens have been strained. This opioid crisis was foreseeable. Even in the late 1800s, they became aware of opioids, and in the form of morphine at that time. And they realized very quickly that it was addictive and that was a problem. So certainly in 1996, when Mr. Sackler is developing and putting on the market OxyContin, he was aware of the degree of addiction associated with that drug. There's no question that he was. I mean, and the purpose of it was solely to make money.